Welcome to the Green Lectionary Podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, and today we will be looking at a text for the final week of the season of creation. My guests today are Debra Reinstra, author of Refugia Faith, Seeking Hidden Shelter, Ordinary Wonders, and the Healing of the Earth, and Douglas Kaufman, Executive Director of the Anabaptist Climate Collaborative. Before we begin our show, I want to tell you about an event Creation Justice Ministries is hosting in partnership with our friends at the BTS Center and Lexington Theological Seminary. On Thursday, October 3rd from 1 to 4 p.m., we will host Politics in the Pulpit, preaching boldly amidst an unprecedented election. This hands-on workshop will include presentations, small group discussions, preaching, and space for curiosity and contemplation. You can register for this event at thebtscenter.org. Join us now as we look at Esther 7 through the lens of creation justice. All right. Our text for this week comes from the book of Esther, chapter 7, verses 1 to 6, 9 to 10, and chapter 9, verses 20 to 22. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition, and the lives of my people. That is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed and to be killed and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace, but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? Who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very pole that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hung Haman on the pole that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. Over to chapter 9. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month, Adar, and also the 15th day of the same month, year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday. And they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor. All right, friends. Where is creation in this passage?
All right, Derek, I'll start with a traditional complaint that you chose a really hard passage. This is, as you were saying, this is the theme of our season. But to be fair to you, I went and looked at the other lectionary passages for this week just to check up on your work. And I thought, yeah, wow, this is just a rough week.
It's just a rough week.
Here we are in the season of creation, and it's just a rough week. So yeah, I didn't know where to begin. So I went to the library and I read the commentary from the Jewish Publication Society, which was enormously helpful. And this particular commentary on Esther, first of all, I had to figure out that you had to read it from right to left, not left to right. There's Hebrew in it. That was very confusing, but I figured it out. And I love the way that the writer suggested that, first of all, we have to see this story as a comedy and even as a burlesque.
Okay.
And it's really about the Feast of Purim. So it's an ideological story. It's not meant to be history. It's meant to be a feast establishing story. I thought that approach was really, really helpful. It just eliminates a lot of problems that we don't have to deal with. And she presented it as a story that's essentially about maintaining Jewish identity in a situation of exile. So that led me to think about the feasting in the story. And I wonder if we could think about it as bad and good feasting. So that's as close to creation as I could get. There is a mention of a garden. Maybe we can talk about the garden. But this question of who gets the fruits of creation, yeah, who gets the delightful celebratory fruits of creation. So there you go. That's my one idea. So maybe Doug, you can help us at this point, because
Yeah, well,
we can talk more about that. But
yeah, no, I have a similar, my own thoughts were similar to that, and seeing in the feasting. I got a little more into it in terms of that it specifically talks about drinking wine, and so I go back to Psalm 104 verse 15, where in this great list of all the bountiful gifts that God has in creation, that wine to gladden the human heart is one of those things. So I just thought it was interesting that wine is specifically mentioned in this feasting, and that there's this feasting is enjoying the fruits of creation. And the book itself, I think it has 10 feasts in it, uh, and there's, if you include the sort of the commanded feast at the end for Purim. So there's, and I forget if this is feast number 5 that we're on right now, but it's a book around the feasting. There's one other place that I went to, and I didn't notice the garden. I'm very interested in seeing. I wouldn't mind talking about that at some point, because I think that's very interesting to me, just because of Persians, and gardens are such an important part of Persian life. But the other place I went is when she talks about life, my my life and the lives of my people. Where that took me was back to another time when, at the time they were called Hebrews rather than Jews, in another empire, in the Egyptian Empire. And some of Terence Fredheim's work on showing that the plagues, the 10 plagues, are ecological disasters or natural disasters, and seeing that as God's response to the Pharaoh's attempt at the annihilation also of Hebrews, when throwing the Hebrew boys into the Nile River. So there's a similar kind of threat, and that God's intent for creation is certainly for yes, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, for life, but really life for all things. This intent that when the empire threatens in this way, that God will be on the side of life.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to think about why it's a comedy, and a comedy full of hyperbole and kind of cartoon villains and almost ridiculous exaggeration. Because comedy, and this is a quote from this commentary, which I think is absolutely right, just from a literary point of view, comedy confirms the belief that the power at work in the universe favors life. And in this case, favors the success of the Jews. So, comedy often works best when it deflects off near disaster. And then you feel the relief of the comic ending much more. So this idea of connecting comedy with God's intended flourishing, I think that's kind of a neat way to approach this book.
Yeah, and this maybe goes into the next question, but the wordings, the kind of wording that I've thought about, and partly from my reading of John Levinson's excellent Old Testament library commentary, is a satirical novella, or it's lampooning the empire. I think. I mean, it's showing these caricatures, and there's just a lot of. It's really, I think it's hilarious, really. Some of the scenes and the way that this the most powerful man in the world, who can't get his wife to do him a favor, but yeah, we'll get into that maybe here in a little bit.
Yeah, we could do a whole feminist reading too. That'd be fun.
Yes.
Yeah, people have felt differently about this, and about the figure of Esther. You often hear that phrase, "for such a time as this," and then it becomes this sort of call to women to be faithful, good, maybe evangelical Christian women. I think we have to remember that Esther joined Ahasuerus's harem. So how she pleased the emperor, right, King Ahasuerus, how she pleased him is unavoidably sexual.
Mhm.
So, she is not some, basically, she and Mordecai both play the game. They figure out how to succeed inside a game that they have been forced to play. So it's the acts of a insignificant, subservient minority within an empire, and in this story, they get the better of it, and they stave off this annihilation. Which, by the way, the Persians were sort of famously tolerant. So even the idea that a decree would go out to annihilate a whole people is kind of like exaggeration, but nevertheless, when you're a subservient minority in an empire, you're going to have fears like that. So that might explain even why Esther's comment, her request is, look, if we were just going to be slaves, I wouldn't say anything, I wouldn't bother you, but we're talking about annihilation here. And that, from his point of view, that would mean like, oh, I've lost a bunch of kind of useful servants, right? I've lost a bunch of subjects. So Haman's plan essentially amounts to treason, which is the self-interest of Ahasuerus on this one. But yeah, I mean, Esther and Mordecai are not necessarily held up as like, moral exemplars of perfect purity. They're held up as people who figure out how to win within a nasty system.
Yeah.
I don't know that has great lessons for us. I don't know. I wouldn't want to just go right there, but yeah.
But and that's I think that's but that's something we see in the scripture often, is not people who are less than my mind immediately goes to Jacob, of like, not necessarily are they righteous, but like they're figuring out how to work within the system. They're figuring out how to be on the side of life in the midst of a system that is an imperial system. So I think there's actually quite a bit here.
And if I can just add into there that the part of Esther that I would maybe highlight as something to follow is that she speaks up, right? That she speaks to the power, even though, and again, this is exaggeration, that somehow you can't talk, that the queen can't talk to the king without risking her life or whatever it is exactly. But she speaks up in a difficult situation. She tells the truth.
Yeah. So, how are we called to interact with creation through this passage? How are, based off of those things that you've observed, where creation is, how are we called to interact with creation here?
Maybe we can go back to this feasting business that we both mentioned. And I think the 10 parties, most of them are seen as exaggerated, decadent, the sorts of things that the extremely privileged indulge in. There's a lot of drunkenness, and Esther leverages this. She gets people in their sort of softened up state, but this idea of a sort of inattentive, almost abusive excess is wrong feasting. And then the feast at the end, the celebratory feast, sort of rejoicing in the work of God, who, by the way, is never mentioned in Esther, right? That's one of the weird things about Esther. Nevertheless, the work of God in figuring out a path through the impossible for the Jewish people in exile. To celebrate that is a different thing. That's a different kind of feasting. So that idea of hoarding and wasting the good fruits of creation, the wine to gladden the human heart, and to see that as the sort of inappropriate indulgence that is depicted here.
Yeah, and sorry if my memory's off on this, but isn't the first feast 160 days or something like that? I mean, just the level of excess And for me, at least, part of the lampooning or the caricature, but it probably also is similar to the lived reality, is this excess, right? And a lot of the problem that happened here had to do with Mordecai not paying Haman the kind of respect that he wanted. There's kind of this honor and shame system, and the king needs to be at the top of it, and so or the emperor, and so when his wife doesn't do what he wants to do, he can't get her to do what he wants to do, so it becomes a state crisis, and all of his counselors, not marital counselors, but his political counselors have to come in and try to, and they come up with this edict that all wives need to listen to their husbands, from a guy who can't get his wife to respond to a simple request. So there's this all this lampooning of the empire, I think, and of imperial systems. And I think, part of that is the kind of, this is where it gets real for me. I mean, the way empires do tend to sacrifice a people. That's what empires do. And to waste God's provision of wine and food to get it to the people who don't need it, and to take it from, it mentions the poor at the end of the presents to the poor being part. So to me, there is this critique of the imperial system that is a part of this, and the way empires abuse God's intentions for creation, God's creation, which again, is similar to what we see in Egypt, and it's it's something that happens again and again. This is just sort of a fun, as Deborah says, a comedic take on it, satirical take on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny and sort of terrible, and perhaps metaphorically fruitful, that the royal court is inattentive, especially King Ahasuerus, to what's really going on because they're so busy partying. So is there a way to make a connection to inattentiveness to injustice because of obsession with consumer excess? I mean, it seems to me that would be maybe a stretch, but I don't know, it could work.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something about, I mean, I think this speaks to what both of you are speaking to, is in spaces where there is excess of food, excess of wine, luxuries, whatever, then there's also a tendency to treat people as excess, that there are excess people here, that there are more than enough people, and you then start to think of people as things to be wholesale removed, right? And other elements of creation can be seen as that as well. You can say, oh, well, man, it feels like we have too many trees. Maybe we should cut down some of these trees. Maybe there's too much water here. That when you begin to live into that sort of excess that you don't actually enjoy, you don't actually appreciate. I think the contrast of the feast at the end is that what we're actually seeing a shift from sorrow to gladness, instead of we've just been happy the whole time and partying, and mourning into holiday instead of every day is a holiday. That we kind of need those contrasts in order to genuinely appreciate the goodness of creation that's around us.
Yeah, and the threat of destruction, Haman's threat of destruction, is premised on the most ridiculous thing. He didn't, his ego was not sufficiently stroked by Mordecai, right? So so now he's going to destroy a whole people. So this idea of this sacrificing people, things, creation, for sort of spurious ego reasons, is also one of the exaggerations in here that maybe we can question in what ways are we maybe doing that,
Mm.
allowing sacrifice zones of land and water and people to create more silly plastics that we don't need, right? That sort of thing, right? What sort of silly reasons are we using to justify sacrificing people and land and water? Kind of a shout out here to the eunuchs in this story. Speaking of, I wouldn't say they're sacrificed people, but eunuchs are often people altered against their will who then have a particular role in a royal court. And they have a really important role here. So a little shout out to the to the eunuchs who, it's another group of people that seem to have taken their disadvantage and figured out a way within this system to at least survive.
Yeah, people outside the sexual norms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly.
And who wouldn't have been able to take part in all of the excesses that were at these feasts. In some ways would, like you said, outside of that. Go ahead.
Well, just one other little point to put in here in my mind is just this aspect of how hoist upon his own petard, is that how you say it, or just the fact that there's this, and again, it's something you can do in a story like this, is how it so matches that he reaps what he sows, that he, here Haman prepares something for his foe and then it becomes his downfall, and that is a part of our reality too, I think, or just an ongoing that we reap what we sow.
Yeah, Doug, I'm curious what you as an Anabaptist tradition person would think about the sort of delight in revenge in this book. So the end of Esther, I found a little bit disturbing in the sort of glee at the revenge of the Jews against Haman's family. And I felt a little bit nervous about that. So I wonder what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I mean, I also felt I felt similar to you in that it didn't seem it's one of the elements in the book that you don't want to emulate, that you don't want to see as an example. And I would even say that I think that the desire for retribution, that desire for revenge, is just feeding into the cycle that just creates the next executioner's stand that someone else is going to, that it feeds into a cycle of violence that I don't think is appropriate as those trying to follow the will of God.
So establish a feast, but no revenge.
Yeah. And I think, and I don't remember all the context, but what they say in verse 22, I mean, what that looks good, as Derek was saying. Well, I forget which one of you now said, but from sorrow into gladness, from mourning into a holiday. Days of feasting and gladness, like they mourning and sorrow and processing that and turning that into gladness, or not turning it into, because that makes it, allowing it to become gladness. Like that to me is the way to handle these kinds of tragedies, potential tragedies.
Well, and there's a beautiful Eucharistic resonance there too.
Yeah.
Mourning into gladness, that is all captured in the Eucharistic practice, in that sacramental practice, through which wine and bread become this feast that we share as people of faith. I mean, this is a good turn to take at an end of an Easter sermon, I suppose, to take that turn to the table and note how in the Lord's Supper we remember the sacrifice of Christ, commune with each other, and anticipate the feast in the new creation. So taking these simple, real products of creation and human craft, right? Wine and bread, creation and human craft working together, and inviting those to be the means of grace for us. that seems to me to have a beautiful resonance with good feasting.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I promised Derek that I wasn't going to mention the gospel of all creatures, but I'll just say that this reminds me of, I mean, part of what, Deborah, part of my own take on creation is to see in the feasting, and to see in the bounty of creation the body of Christ. I'm more of a deep incarnational person out of this
Mhm.
sense of the creation proclaims the gospel through the way animals give their lives for us, and even plants give their lives for our feasting, and to see in that. So for me, every meal in a sense is a Eucharistic
Yes.
meal. So I
Yes.
just wanted to bring that up as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think that's sacramentality summed up, that what we do in the sacraments changes the way we experience the rest of creation too.
Mhm.
That it is a distillation of a truth that is all through creation.
Yeah, yeah.
You're doing good. You're doing good.
We're finding something.
We might be stuck at this point. I don't
I
know.
I don't know that you are. I don't know that you are. We're rounding into third here.
Okay.
Yeah, I was gonna say, have your next question, right?
So where is there in light of all those things that you just said, and in light of, thinking about good feasting and bad feasting, and thinking about um empire and excess, and thinking about all of these pieces, where is there a call to action for the church? One of the things that I was thinking of is that the lectionary gives us this piece of Esther, but it's really hard to read just this piece of Esther without reading all of Esther.
Mhm.
And so even those pieces, Doug, that you were mentioning that are hard, we actually can't get away from them in our thinking about uh the story, because it really is just kind of one self-contained story. Um, so good, bad, indifferent. Where is there a call to action um, in this passage, and I guess in some ways in the story of Esther?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and get started, and then maybe come back around. One of the things that I thought about is how, when Haman's trying to talk Ahasuerus into annihilating the Jews, part of what he talks about is that they don't obey all the king's laws.
Mm.
And so part of what's going on here is there's this people that doesn't quite fit into empire.
Mm.
And I think I would call the church to be people who don't fit into empire. And I also happen to think that the United States of America is an empire, or, we can argue a little bit about formal or informal and all that. Now I start to get a little worried about being too specific about anything. But one of the things that I was thinking about in particular was how much of my, I get an Apple News feed just because I have an iPhone and I'm too lazy to figure out another way to do it. And how much of that is filled with things like this, like who shamed whom, or who said something nasty about somebody else. Like how much of the politics is around just relationships, and who, that people weren't nice to this person, and how little of it, of political coverage, is around like policies, and how does this actually affect people, like the people whose livelihoods are affected by what they're talking about. I would want to center then more, what are our policies doing to creation, to the poor, to children, the most vulnerable.
Yeah. So maybe attend to kind of systemic analysis and not the surfacey outrage news
Yeah.
as much. Yeah, that's a good call for all of us. And I do think it's appropriate to connect Esther with the question of maintaining our distinctive identity in the midst of empire, however you want to define it, without hiding under a bunker, right? So maintaining our presence and our witness as people of faith, even while not obeying all the rules, so to speak. And by that, I don't mean laws necessarily. I mean like cultural customs and, sort of informal fads and foibles, or the real systemic policy stuff that we can resist as a witness as well. So that gets right into climate change and being voices against these systemic abuses of land and people that are so relevant to climate change, as well as being the people who are interested in and active in reworking those systemic issues into policy and community life and practices that can be life-giving. So yeah, to turn this mourning into gladness in those ways. But we got it. I mean, we're in the system, right? We don't have a choice. Yeah. Neither did the Jews when they were taken off to exile. I don't want to equate, living life in affluent America to that, but that question of creating or maintaining a distinctive identity, even amid this really tangled web of empire systems, that's tricky, and churches disagree on how to do it, right? So that's really hard. We were lamenting that a little bit before we started recording. Churches disagree on how to be distinctive, but to focus that distinctiveness on life-giving practices, including feasting. It doesn't always have to be like justice activism. Part of justice activism is feasting together too.
I mean, this question of how we maintain a distinctive Christ-like identity in our culture, I think is such a big one for us right now, because I think we have brothers and sisters in the faith who look at their particular brand of Christian nationalism as being distinctive from the culture that is, permissive and progressive and full of sin. And then we have people on the other side of the spectrum who see, us as an empire, this country as an empire, and see being able to feed everyone, clothe everyone, house everyone, care for the environment, that's what is swimming upstream against the cultural tide. And we kind of all agree on being distinctive, but we haven't agreed what distinctive means, because we can't actually agree on what our culture is.
Exactly.
It's
yeah. And we accuse each other of being influenced by culture when in reality we all are.
Right.
It's a pointless accusation because it's inevitable.
Absolutely. And I think in the midst of that, there's a lot of soul searching to be done in the midst of that we are all very much swimming in the waters of American culture and all of the things that come along with that, and what it means to go against the tide, is costly. I mean, that's the other piece of this, right? Is that for Esther and for Esther's people, being the people who were distinctive from the empire was costly. And I don't know that we often talk about that enough. The cost of what it means to be people who are on the outside of empire.
And we, oh, sorry.
No, please go.
Yeah, no, because we were talking a little bit about Mordecai and Esther not really being exemplars for us, but in a sense they are at least the Rorschach tests for us, or somehow, they are reflective of our reality, because they are figuring out how to play the court game, and they're using it for the ends that they believe that well, we don't know what they believe, I guess, because they don't mention God, but that they believe God has called them to was what I was about to say.
Yeah.
I didn't read the Greek version, right? I think the Greek version does have God in it, but yeah. Anyway, that they reflect that problem that you're talking about, Derek, and that's very well said. I wanted to bring one other little aspect into this that in terms of my observations, and this is as someone who's on the side of we need to beware the empire. For me, one way that the church has been an alternative space is through things like Mennonite World Conference or Mennonite Central Committee, which are these global organizations outside of NATO or the United Nations, and that are also alternative media and alternative relationships. And the ways that for me has helped give me access to people and to stories that don't fit into the Wall Street Journal or New York Times or Los Angeles Times narrative, and has helped me to see how the impact of American policies across the world in Indonesia and Korea, obviously much more Korea than Indonesia, but just the way that the church, by being a global communion that functions a bit differently, not differently enough, right? I mean, a number of those institutions are very American, but yeah, that I just wanted to bring that up too in the midst of empire.
Yeah, and sometimes empire can be super useful, and we're also, I think, called as the church to always be asking, in our effort to be distinctive, sometimes to be distinctive Jesus followers, we actually do what the empire is already doing. So protecting people's rights, maybe, or at least some of the things that we're trying to do through the mechanisms of this big nation state and our influences everywhere. But I love the idea that the church is sort of an alternative network of people, relationships, and customs that is trans global. I don't know, is that the right word? Anyway, global, and gives us this sort of underneath perspective on the big machinations of empire up above. Sometimes we can pull those empire levers and they're very useful. Sometimes we have to just absolutely resist them and call them out. But how are we going to do that unless we have a different perspective? So to have that other alternative network of relationships and connections, that's one of the things the church really does best.
Yeah. I want to maybe kind of circle back around to where we started, and maybe just say that one other call to action for the church is to be a place where we feast well. Where we have good celebrations that honor the goodness of creation, that are doing the work of turning mourning into gladness, and are doing the work of turning sorrow into holiday, and are doing the work of sending food to the poor. That are feasting, that we can in some ways be a model of what it means to celebrate creation, to celebrate the goodness that creation has, to say that like this drive that we have for creation justice isn't all about austerity, that it is actually also about really rejoicing in the beauty and goodness and like the colors and smells and tastes and sounds of creation, which all should be celebrated. And that we should equitably share in as humans. And maybe the church can be a space where the good feasting happens.
Yeah, and a kind of eschatological promise, right? We're modeling the good feasting that is the vision of all creation, rest and feasting. And yeah, I don't know, maybe that's your next book, Derek.
There we go.
The Good Feasting Cookbook. I want you to tell us some good recipes now. Like when you talk about good feasting, exactly what do you mean?
I mean, it feels like, I mean, if we're gonna go to the eschatological lengths, then those must be some damn good recipes.
I have tasted some of the food that I hope to taste at that feast. Here and there.
Yep.
Oh, that feels like a great place to stop. Debra, Doug, thank you so much for indulging me. Thank you for humoring me with dealing with this challenging text, which is, for better or for worse, part of our tradition and something that we have to wrestle with. Maybe once every 3 years, but we got to do it. But thank you so much for your insight and wisdom and generosity and sharing in this conversation.
And thank you for being a gracious host, Jerry.
Indeed, it's been a delight as always.
Thank you for joining us for the Green Lectionary Podcast. This episode was produced by Sprocket Wagner, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. Please like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and help us spread the word with a good review. Leave us a comment to let us know how you've used the show and how we can make it more useful for your ministry. You can learn more about this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org.
Our story comes alive within these pages, for every time and place throughout the ages. God speaks and is heard, and the enduring word calls us to care for our world as we share the love that can set creation free. Restoring the earth to wholeness, peace, and harmony. Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're all bound within these pages. There's always new life to be found.